one of our women leading government meetings. And Senator McBride is, again, a leader in the legislature. I think we at the executive committee have talked about getting Senator McBride before us. So I was really excited when both of them agreed to talk to us at our conference today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the two of them some questions, and that they will respond. And depending on how the time goes, there should be some time for questions. So my first question is, there are a lot of new and particularly young women in the state legislature. How has that changed your perception of the culture of the state legislature and the priorities?
I'll let Senator McBride start on this one. She can give the holistic view. I've got a very personal view on this.
Yeah. Well, first off, thanks, Anne-Marie, for bringing us together. I feel like a conversation with Kyle and me about the legislature and the bills that we're working on is basically just how we spend our Sundays. So this is quite a pleasure to be able to have a conversation with you and Senator Gay about the work that we're doing. And first off, I just want to thank you all for the work that you all are doing. I think a lot of times when we talk about diversity in government, whether we're talking about diversity in administration roles or elected official roles, a lot of times people think that that's just a superfluous luxury. But we know that diversity in government, including having women in government, is not a luxury. It's a necessity in a democracy. And you can't craft effective solutions, whether that's policy solutions, regulations, programs, or legislation. You can't craft effective solutions for diverse communities if you don't have the full diversity of those communities at the table. And that's true at the local, state, and federal level. And so I am really excited to be part of an increasingly diverse legislature that has, in our freshman class in the state Senate, 4 new freshman members, 3 of whom are women, and all 3 of them are young women. And we represent very different backgrounds. We've got Kyle, who is right now the only mom of young children in the legislature. You have someone like me who is transgender and LGBTQ. You have Senator Pinckney, who's a Black queer woman. And so you not only have more women and more young women in the legislature, but also more diversity within that womanhood. And I think that results in better conversations and better policy. I think one of the things we are seeing is that when we're talking about gender equality and we're talking about expanding opportunity for women, we're not just talking about legal equality. We're talking about meaningful economic policy that empower women, that support women, that remove barriers to women being able to pursue their dreams and truly thrive in our society as fully realized, independent human beings. And I think that that's a byproduct of that increasing diversity, not just of women in the legislature, but the increasing diversity you see among the women in the legislature. And it's just such a pleasure and a privilege to be part of that freshman class, joining a lot of returning members who have and bring that really intersectional approach to policymaking that was, I think, absent decades ago when I first started getting involved in politics, when there really weren't many women voices, and they certainly didn't reflect the full diversity of womanhood in our state.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think what's really interesting is that both Senator McBride and I have been to Dover before we came to Dover, right? Senator McBride was down here arguing for marriage equality, arguably her first and one of her best forays into policy and really standing up for equity, in Delaware. I came down to Dover to argue for the Equal Rights Amendment. And when we talk about the difference that Senator McBride has articulated in it's not only that my voice as a mom is heard, it's that my voice as a mom is able to have a conversation with Senator McBride's voice, with Representative Longhurst's voice, with Senator Pinckney's voice, and that we are having those conversations, I think, that often happen in our community. They're happening in a place where decisions are being made. And it is that openness, honestness with and being very mindful of those intersectionalities that lead us to better policy. I mean, just very honestly, I don't think I'd be sitting here today unless I had been advocating for the ERA and had to lobby people who just didn't understand why I felt like a second-class citizen in my own state, why I was concerned that without equal rights, that there could be an erosion of my rights down the road. And so faced that, and now to be able to be in a place where not only I don't have to be the person lobbying, those individuals. It's really transformative, and personally so, as well as I think a good direction for our state.
What bills are you most excited about that you think will make the greatest impact in our state?
Well, I think we're going to hopefully talk about SB 1. So I'm going to let Senator McBride talk about SB 1, which all I can say is I'm incredibly excited about the possibility for paid family medical leave. Incredibly excited for the idea that there are so many people in our care system that are finally being seen, and in our legislation. But personally, I have been really excited about some of the elections work that we've been doing. We saw in 2020 a transformative election year, and I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the act of voting. We saw access to the polls we saw access to the polls increase, and we saw it happen in a safe and effective way, in a secure way, and we saw participation skyrocket. And what that tells me is that there are a ton of Delawareans who want their voice to be heard, who want to see at the table, and they just need us to make it accessible for them. And so one of the things I worked on that passed last year and was signed into law was Senate Bill 5. We worked on automatic voter registration. And I'm super proud of that bill because not only does it lay the groundwork now to register voters through DMV, but it's going to create mechanisms so that when individuals are interacting with their government going forward, there's going to be openings and opportunities for us to get those folks registered. We'll talk a little bit more about maybe some voting laws that are affecting local governments coming up. But I just think that with initiatives like SB 5 and hopefully with the passing of HB 75, that will take absentee voting out of our Constitution and allow us to expand it responsibly in code. I'm just very excited that we are in a place in Delaware. We are interested in expanding the franchise and making sure everyone who is eligible to vote has an opportunity to vote.
And for the people listening, the bill numbers that you share, I'm putting in the chat so that people can track them.
Thank you. Yeah, we talk in numbers. Stop us anytime.
Yeah. We have legislator brains, so it's always, we think of SBs and HBs. Kyle already touched on it, but I think one of the most important bills that we can pass this legislative session, both from the perspective of our state as a whole, but also in particular from the perspective of supporting and empowering economically women in our state, is Senate Bill 1, which is called the Healthy Delaware Families Act, which would establish an up to 12-week paid family and medical leave insurance program in Delaware. This is legislation modeled after best practices that have already been passed in now 9 states, plus Washington, D.C. And in essence, what it creates is a statewide insurance program that would provide partial wage replacement to Delaware workers, eligible Delaware workers who are out on leave, to welcome a child into their family, to take care of a family member struggling through a serious illness, or to get life-saving treatment themselves for a serious health condition. The legislation has gone through a couple iterations. I introduced the bill back in May of 2021. And in the months and almost now here since introduction, I've engaged really in a whole of Delaware conversation up and down the state with stakeholders in and out of government, from supporters to those who had concerns. And that conversation resulted in a compromise bill that was introduced, substitute bill that was introduced about a month ago, which the Senate just recently passed last week that made a number of meaningful compromises and changes to the legislation, including essentially replicating the eligibility and definitions under the federal FMLA law, which provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid job protected leave for many workers in our society. It also doesn't automatically include businesses under 10 employees for the parental leave component of the bill, or under 25 employees for the medical and family caregiving component of the bill. And so there were a number of compromises that really create a Delaware solution to the Delaware challenges that we face. And what we know is that paid family and medical leave really is one of the core contributors to both the lack of progress and increasingly the actual regression that we've seen in women's workforce participation within the United States. Right now, economists call what we're going through a shecession because COVID has pushed so many women out of the workforce because of those increased caregiving responsibilities that disproportionately fall on women. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not just passionate about paid leave, but also working with Kyle on issues of early childhood education and affordable childcare. Because when you really combine those two policy goals, they remove the most significant barriers to women's workforce participation. And so I'm hopeful after we pass SB 1, which I'm very confident we will, that we're going to move into the childcare space to make sure that we bring down the costs facing families when it comes to those critical years before kindergarten that, again, put oftentimes so many barriers in the way of women fully participating in the workforce. And so hopefully we can reverse that trend. We can put more women back to work, which I know a lot of our employers are struggling through worker shortages right now. And sometimes that worker shortage is a reason why people oppose the bill. But the reality is that worker shortage is a reason to support the bill, since we know it's an effective strategy to putting people back to work, especially women in our society. And so I'm really excited. The bill passed the Senate. It's over in the House. Governor Carney endorsed the legislation in his State of the State address, and it's become a priority for him and his administration because we truly believe this is a central strategy to not just building back from COVID and repairing our economy, but also helping to build a more equitable future for Delaware and our economy by ensuring that women can increasingly participate and stay in the workforce.
And it's been, I would say, thankfully, we have done the work, and Senator McBride has done the work to get us there on paid family medical leave. And we have an op-ed out there talking about this, intersection of childcare and the care economy, and we want to continue to focus on that. I think it's really important that we acknowledge there's legislation that we can do, but then funding itself is a statement of our priorities and our values. And so when we talk about funding for childcare, workforce development, especially in places where we need workers like childcare, we can really make a statement about how we are supporting women by putting our dollars where it reflects that support. And I also just want to pull it back to your original question, Anne-Marie, how have we seen things change? I was down in Dover advocating for a bill before I was elected that would help cover IVF insurance, right? And so that was almost like we see now that we've gone from that to Representative Minor Brown introducing her Momnibus package, which I think it's 8 bills that will substantially change the way that women are treated when they are, before childbirth and after childbirth, making sure there's supports, making sure that the resources are allocated. And so I just think, when we go from talking about small changes for women, and now we're at the point where 2 of our main priorities are the Momnibus and paid family medical leave, I think it really reflects a sea change. And I think we're only going to be focusing on those economic realities and the needs of women going forward.
One thing I would note, and I've observed, is that Senator McBride, you do not shy away from talking to audiences that have been very critical of SB 1 and frankly responding to some of their feedback with some changes. So in a time where our political world is very divided, I think you've kind of shown how you can actually move the ball forward on some of these really meaningful issues without just relying on, the
chorus
people
who
that
already
right.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really appreciate that, and thank you. One of the things that I decided was, if at the start, if I was going to have any chance of getting a bill of this kind through the legislature in a time frame that I believed we needed to act, the only way to do that was to be able to say that I have talked to everyone, that I have gone and spoken to people who are in support and those who oppose. And I could defend every word of the original bill, and I still believe that it's the gold standard. But I also recognize that I don't necessarily have a monopoly on good ideas. That when you're building a majoritarian coalition, you've got to work with people that don't necessarily see eye to eye with you. And my hope is that as this bill moves forward, and hopefully, and I'm very optimistic that it will reach the governor's desk, that to your point, at a time when politics, particularly at the national level, is so divided and facing such gridlock, that we can show that if folks do come around the table in good faith, and that's very key, in good faith, that we might not all get everything that we want, but that we can work together and make progress. And that is the Delaware way at its best.
Right.
And if we can channel that in more ways and in more issues, then I think we'll be able to be that laboratory of democracy that I think the states, and that Delaware in particular, should and could be.
Okay. So what legislation is out there that could affect governance at the local level? A lot of our participants are local governments.
Sarah, do you want to maybe talk about virtual meetings, and I'll talk about some of our FOIA fun that we have here at the legislature?
Yeah, absolutely. Many of you probably are already aware of legislation that was sponsored by Senator Hansen last year that was passed and signed into law. And I'll get into the specifics of it, but this bill around virtual meetings was really one of the many bills that came from the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, obviously, the way we are engaging right now is one example of the ways COVID has upended our lives. And while I am exceptionally over Zoom meetings and am just like ready to meet with and be with people in person, we also know that the realities of virtual meetings have made government and public bodies more accessible to people, particularly those who face disproportionate barriers to fully participating, whether we're talking about people with disabilities or working families that struggle to get the time off necessary to drive to a meeting that might be an hour or 2 hours away. And so seeing that COVID really helped to transform our understanding of what's possible in terms of meeting accessibility, Senator Hansen put together legislation that seeks to strike that right balance of harnessing the lessons of COVID while also still ensuring that there is physical opportunities, in-person opportunities to meet with and engage with your government and public bodies. And so she introduced legislation that would allow public bodies, whether we're talking about local elected bodies or boards and commissions, to have a essentially hybrid option to meet virtually and to have participation from members and the public virtually. The legislation does require that there is an anchor location with at least one member of that body present. But by allowing those bodies to have members participate virtually, to have members of the public participate virtually, I think this will ensure that we are taking the best of the lessons from COVID and really operationalizing those lessons moving forward. There's some conversations that have been happening and continue to happen about, are there ways for us to perfect this legislation so that it mitigates, potential risks while maintaining that strong accessibility? And I think we'll see how this materializes over the next 2-3 years as we move out of the sort of public health emergency, state of emergency era that we've been in, and this legislation actually becomes the foundation the foundation for how we do these virtual meetings. And so what I would say to folks is, it really is important to have as much in-person participation as possible. We don't want it to be, 99% of people are participating virtually and only one person is at the meeting. And so, you've got a council meeting where you've got members of the public who come and there's literally only one member of council there. We don't want this to be abused. And I think the best way to make sure we can continue to strike that balance is for us to see it as a resource, but to have in-person availability still the default. But I think it's an exciting development and really is an important 21st century approach to making government more accessible and available for people.
Yeah, it was a huge change, and I think a necessary one. Again, we are continually learning from our experience during COVID, and then we are actually now, I think, learning even more things as we transition back and understand how difficult some of those transitions could be that maybe we didn't anticipate. So, I'm going to share a couple of things that are under consideration right now, related to FOIA. And, I know I spoke to this group before, and you might remember that my other hat I wear is as an attorney. And prior to being elected, I did a lot of work with local governments. I try not to these days because of potential conflicts of interest. But I still kind of look at this from the angle of how do these laws affect the local governance structure, who are the people in each of the municipalities that are going to have to comply, and what does it mean functionally for them to do that? And so some of you, and I'm sure many of you are aware of Senator Lockman's bill, SB 233, that relates to municipal elections. And the goal there, it's Senator Lockman and Representative Shoup, and they are really looking to ensure that we're shoring up our franchise, right? Making sure that voters have access to the polls by requiring municipalities to use the Department of Elections voter rolls, so that should someone be living in a municipality, be registered to vote there, or registered or living and I would say eligible to vote there. If they're registered at the state level, then they can vote there. The bill does allow for those unique situations. We know places like Rehoboth Beach that would maybe allow property owners or business owners to vote. Those separate registrations can be managed by the municipality. But at the end of the day, if someone is registered on the state system, then they would be eligible to vote as a resident where they are eligible under the local rules. So it's a big change. And we actually just heard this bill in committee. I'm lucky enough to chair the Elections and Government Affairs Committee. It's been a great experience, can apply some of my experience and learn even more things. And there was a lot of good feedback about how it would increase access to the polls for many people, but that the local governments there are some that would face challenges in implementation. And so I think what we're going to see going forward is a real substantive conversation about what those challenges are for implementation. And I think that Senator Lockman is very committed to making sure that we are expanding access in a way that's not going to undermine the local governance structures that you all have. So if you're interested in that one, that's Senate Bill 233. And it has not been heard in the Senate yet. I assume it will go soon and it may even be is it on the agenda here? I don't know if it's on the agenda today. I have to check my agenda for today. I don't believe it is. The other thing is there's a couple bills coming out of the House related to FOIA. So I know that I heard from some of the local governance administrators, some local FOIA coordinators about a bill I had that would have, in my mind, prevented some abuse and harassment of local FOIA coordinators. And there was some, I would say a lot of pushback from other stakeholders on how that might endanger transparency. So that bill won't move forward in its current form, but we're continuing to look at ways in which we can provide adequate protections so that your FOIA coordinators, or you, if that's you, are not unduly harmed or inconvenienced, or in some cases that your safety is protected. Because I know it can be difficult sometimes to manage the rights of individuals to seek information, but also protect the well-being often of local public servants. But there are some things moving in from the House. And one of them would require public comment at any public meeting. So I know that that's probably status quo for many of you, but there may in fact be public meetings you have that don't include public comment. This bill would change that. It would require it. I would encourage you to look at the bill. That is, Anne-Marie, if you're looking, it's HB 293, the House Substitute 1 for HB 293. There's reasonable boundaries around it. The legislation is written with a mind to ensure that we're not required to listen to every public commenter, that if someone is harassing or being inappropriate, they do not have the right to speak. So it seeks to strike that balance between providing you the ability to effectively manage your meetings with the right for the public to comment. And I think as we see that bill move through the House, we're going to get to the heart of where that balance truly is and if that balance can be struck, understanding oftentimes the burdens that are already on you in holding your public meetings. So I would definitely take a look at that one if it interests you. There's another bill in the House, HB 203, that would make it impossible for FOIA to be suspended during a public emergency. So I'm sure many of you had the experience of, what do we do on March 13, 2020, when we shut down? And if we can't have people in the office and people can't be near each other, how are we going to copy files? How are we going to get things to people? And FOIA was suspended at that time. This bill 203 would make that impossible during even a public emergency. And so again, it's really a weighing of the interests and understanding how we can both protect the public's right to access, but also ensure that we are not putting undue burdens. And I think the question's out on what is that standard, that undue burden, right? And we have to have those conversations. And I hope that you will engage in those conversations and share with your legislators where you're coming from on those bills. And then I would say the only other thing I want to mention is we did recently pass a positive change for our municipal fire and police workers. So of course, if there's anything in that realm that are affecting any of your volunteer firefighters, any of your local police agencies, feel free to always let us know how we can be supportive of you in that role as well.
Okay, I'm in a week that our council meeting went till almost 11 o'clock and we didn't get through the full agenda. So
right, I know.
Public comment on everything on the agenda. So Senator Gay, can you share with us the process for charter changes?
Sure, absolutely. We wanted to touch on this because it comes up pretty, I guess, more often than I would have anticipated. And coming from the perspective of helping towns and cities through this process, on the inside, I can tell you it's a lot less intimidating than even I thought, and hopefully than you think. We, as a General Assembly, have the responsibility to essentially approve charter changes that come from the municipalities. And so we do have an obligation to review them, but oftentimes we will defer to the intent of the local governing structure. Obviously, we wouldn't pass anything contrary to state or federal law, and we would ask and inquire of questions when flags are raised. But at the end of the day, it's really important for us to be able to empower local governments to execute their duties in a way they see fit. So if you're thinking about a charter change, if your town council or your mayor has come to you and they're like, how do we get started? I think a lot of people think they need to hire an attorney. You can hire an attorney to do this. You can also just work with your legislative representatives, right? You can work with your house rep, your senator, and talk about the changes that are needed. Oftentimes, you'll work with your solicitor to kind of craft the local resolutions. What we like to see, what is really effective in making these go quickly, is that we have some type of resolution or vote from the local governing body that says that this is how we would like to modify our charter, and this is the language we'd like. And we have attorneys here at Legislative Hall that can help draft the bill, that can make sure that your intent is reflected in the correct legislative form. And once you kind of get to that point, it's just a matter of asking your rep or your senator to move the bill. And those bills will go through in the House. It's usually the Administration Committee. In the Senate, it's usually the Election and Government Affairs Committee. So if you have any questions, obviously you can reach out to anyone on the Election and Government Affairs Committee, but most of our legislators are really familiar with working with local towns and cities to make sure that we kind of can get what you need when you need it. I think the biggest thing is timing. We are only in session from January through June. And so ensuring that if you have a need that arises on the off season, you're prepared in January to bring it to us. And hopefully you don't tell us on June 29th that you have a very essential charter change that must happen. We'll get it done. We'll figure it out. Somehow we'll get it done. But these things always go more smoothly when we plan ahead. So yeah, I appreciate you giving me a chance to share that, because I think we want to be accessible and we want to be partners with the local municipalities in making sure their charters reflect their intent.
Well, thank you. So what exciting things do you see on the horizon in terms of legislation?
I'll yield to Senator McBride. I've been talking a lot. You're muted though, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. I think there's a lot that's on the agenda that is already introduced, and then there are, of course, items that we are all working on that haven't yet been introduced that I think folks should anticipate coming forward either later this session or potentially next year when the legislature reconvenes. Kyle, I think, will talk a bit about LEOBOR, which the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights reforms that is on the agenda. It's already been introduced as legislation. There have been conversations, but she'll speak some more. There's legislation over in the House that continuously is on the agenda, whether that's marijuana, which recently failed, the legalization of recreational marijuana, which recently failed in the House, although there is talk that there may be conversations going on that could result in that coming back either this session or I certainly wouldn't be surprised if next year it comes back and continues to be an issue until action is taken when it comes to with regard to recreational cannabis. Fines and fee reform is over in the House, and Kyle probably has a better sense of where that's going as the chair of the judiciary. For me, I think I have really fallen in love with this intersection between equality and economic opportunity. And so this has really become a niche for me. And so there are issues around pay transparency that I am currently looking into to explore opportunities for us to help to further address the pay disparities that women face. Yesterday was Equal Pay Day, and obviously we know that discrimination in pay is illegal, but that there are still barriers that disproportionately fall on women. Again, paid family and medical leave is part of that by pushing women out of the workforce and therefore stunting their career momentum. But other issues like pay transparency when it comes to the hiring of new employees, that is one policy that can disproportionately impact and empower women and help to address the pay disparities that we so often see. So that's another area that I'm looking at and am eager to introduce some legislation on. And I'll yield to my wonderful colleague, Senator Gay, to talk about some of the other bills that are pending that I mentioned and some of the other issues that she might be looking at.
Yeah, she set me up for to talk about the hard ones, so I got you. It's so interesting as we hear from everyone, right? We hear a lot from our constituents. We hear from people up and down the state on these issues. And, as Senator McBride said, LEOBOR is one of those issues that we have heard from so many stakeholders and individuals. The LEOBOR reform is Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, and I'm sure some of you here will have police agencies in your municipality. Some of you may not, and the bill is intended to roll back some of those what have been viewed as protections, but have also now come to be seen as barriers to transparency. And so the bill takes a look at two different things. It looks at records and accessibility to records, and it takes a look at oversight and whether community review boards or kind of another body to take a look at police action will be beneficial. And really the goals here are twofold. One is that building that trust between the community and the police force, that collaboration, and the other is that transparency, right? That openness and understanding that we are really transparency in furtherance of trust, understanding that the community can be comfortable with how discipline is being conducted, et cetera. It's been a really touchy issue. It's been something that I know will affect so many local governments, especially those that have municipalities. Especially those who have agencies, because if the bill in its current form or potentially in a substituted form is likely to defer to a municipality to set up some of these structures. And so I think what we're going to be talking about is I'm hopeful that this bill passes because I believe that the sponsors are looking at a balanced and fair way to move forward. I think that they're looking at making sure that they can make the most impact for victims, people who have been victimized, and for people who may be if we don't start to move in the right direction. And I think that we're going to have to move towards education and collaboration and communication with our municipal governments. And I think we're going to have real serious conversations about what the intent of the state legislation is and what that means for you all. And so I guess when we talk about Leah Bohr coming down, if this is something that passes, I think I want you to hear from us that I think the passage is not the end of the conversation. And I think that we'll continue to see legislation in this space. And I hope that we can continue to be resources for you as we move forward and to kind of understand how we're going to wrestle with the changes that so many people are asking for and that we've really come to understand that Delaware needs. So that is the big one that's on the horizon. I'll say for my point of view, I'll also mention fines and fees. I'm greatly invested in this, as Sarah McBride knows. As you know, I think we, as an attorney, as a former prosecutor, we need to be fairly allocating our fines and fees, and we need to understand that we can't fund our governments based on the backs of folks who just have the least ability to pay. So we need to figure out a way to move forward again on this. And I think that there's a very good bill that would do this without affecting our municipal services. And that's key, right? Not undermining the volunteer firefighters who day in and day out are protecting us. And so, there will be steps along the way, but I think this is the first best step. And that we'll continue to have that conversation. I just also want to add, and I hope that it speaks to the folks in the room, we could do a lot to protect victims in Delaware, to protect victims of crime, and to empower individuals who have been victimized in our justice system. And we have a 30-year-old Victims' Bill of Rights. I'm excited to say that we're going to be kind of launching an initiative to really assess whether we are meeting the needs today and how we can change it and make it better. Specifically this year, I'm hopeful to file a bill that will address the rights of sexual assault victims who often weren't considered when really momentous legislation like our current Victims' Bill of Rights was first passed 30 years ago. So I think there's a lot we can do for that population. I think there's a lot that's overdue. And I would point you to some great work that Representative Griffith is doing in that area too. So more to come.
Okay. So do you have any other interesting tales from Legislative Hall, or do you want to open it to questions from our participants?
I'm sure we can avail you. So let's see if there's any questions, and if not, we can always, politicians always talk, right?
Okay. Yes, that's true, right? So I think I can somehow unmute you. Maybe I can. I thought I could. You might be able to unmute yourself if you're in the audience, but if not, you can put your questions in the chat. I do want to share that from the local perspective, I have found the virtual meeting to be very helpful. The challenge is technology does not always work, and managing expectations. While the law acknowledges that technology doesn't always work, and if it doesn't work, that doesn't affect the validity of the meeting or the actions. Public doesn't always feel that way. But I don't know if that's something that can be legislatively fixed. I think that's more an issue of managing expectations within our own communities.
I agree. And I think one of the things I've encouraged, so I actually, even though I represent the northernmost part of Delaware, I actually have 3 municipalities, Arden, Ardencroft, and Ardentown, who have their own unique characteristics as municipalities. But I've encouraged them, and I would encourage others to look at your ARPA funding, your ARP money, and think about technology investments as an excellent way to leverage those, because we don't think we're going back, and we want to make sure that everyone, can have access. But I know that from my personal experience, the technology can cause more conflicts too. So we're just trying to get everyone up to date with it. Yeah.
And we did, in Lewis, we did use ARPA funds to upgrade all of our technology, and we see now the streaming and virtual access, even if the meeting itself isn't virtual. We see that as just the way we're going to move forward. So we do have a question here from Stephanie Rizzo. Would you ever cast a not voting vote? Why or why not?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I have, and I think you have too, right?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I was just going to say, well, first off, I think if you have a conflict, it's totally appropriate to go not voting sort of without question. It's an interesting question when it comes to not voting on substantive legislation, that there's not a conflict. I'm sort of 2 minds. I remember being an advocate, being frustrated when a politician wouldn't take a clear stand on an issue. Having said that, now also sitting on the floor and having to weigh some of these issues, there are instances where I am genuinely so conflicted that it's hard to decide whether to vote yes or no. I'm not comfortable enough endorsing the legislation with a yes vote, but I'm also not so opposed that a clear statement of opposition feels appropriate. And so I have not gone not voting on a bill yet. I don't see myself doing that, but I have a little bit more sympathy for folks who do choose to do that. I think it can be abused. I think there are a lot of issues where people might go not voting, and it's like, you're not really undecided on that genuinely. That's a political decision. But having now struggled through a number of votes myself in my own mind, I do see scenarios where I think it would be understandable if a person is so truly undecided to say, ultimately, I do not feel comfortable endorsing this or explicitly opposing. And as long as it's not abused, I think that's an okay exception.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the abuse is the problem. I think I was very much of the same mind, and I said, why aren't they taking a stand, right? Like on this bill that I've been advocating for. And that's easy to say as an advocate. It's harder to say. I can think of a couple instances, because I was taking notes, because thinking about a couple instances where I think this comes up. I think one of them, just for everyone, is if they have a personal or moral stance that their district disagrees on. And, we really strive to represent our districts. And I think sometimes there are places that you won't go, even if that's where your district, you can't take that vote. And that hasn't happened to me, but I've seen it happen to people, and I'm sympathetic to how individuals feel about that representation versus personal personal guidepost. And so that I think that's a reason why we see some people do it. For me, I have gone not voting because of a conflict. I feel like I use my brain way too much when I'm trying to think about conflicts because of my legal role in the community, and it is a small state. But I think that's happened once, that I've had to go not voting for a conflict, and we've seen our senator, our colleague Senator Pardee, I think, do it recently too, just for conflict reasons. But the other would be, sometimes you see the right value statement in a bill, but the way that the bill is drafted or the implications where it could go, maybe things aren't taken into account, you're concerned about the implementation. And I think that's a very nuanced way to look at it, but you have to be you don't want to vote against a bill because you believe that we should be working on that issue, but maybe you're concerned that it goes too far, doesn't go far enough, or could be interpreted wrong. And that's probably something that I think about more because I spent my career litigating the code and see how these arguments can play out in court. And Anne-Marie's shaking her head because we've had those conversations before about, how can a municipality go forward when things are ambiguous. The other thing I would say, and I have not gone not voting for this reason, is that the words on the page are one thing, the debate around it is another. And where there is some conflict or things that are not represented with the words on the page, some intent that's stated in the debate that I don't agree with, or that I do agree with and the bill doesn't represent it, right? That is a point in time where I need to make sure that my intent is accurately reflected. And if the words on the page don't reflect the debate or the intent that's reflected in the debate, that could present a problem again with interpretation. That's incredibly nuanced and I think very rare. But I think to Senator McBride's point are very good reasons why we have not voting. And I agree, when it comes to substantive bills, we should do our very best to vote yay or nay on those.
Actually, and I want to build on, because it's a topic that's come up a couple of times in conversations that I've been in, panels that I've been on, and I think Kyle accurately described a dynamic that does occur, and I think she described it without a passing judgment one way or the other. But I'm going to pass judgment on it a little bit more. I do see. I think she is absolutely right. There are instances where there may be a legislator who morally believes in a policy, but whose district may be opposed. And there are two models for being a legislator. There's the delegate or trustee model, right? The delegate model is you go and you are there to represent your district and what your district wants, period. And then there's the trustee model, which is, yes, your district and what they want and what they need are paramount, but you're also elected to exercise your own judgment. That we are not a direct democracy, and in a representative democracy, we are there to take the time to think about, explore, research, listen on issues in a way that the general public just doesn't have the time or capacity or ability to dive into at that depth. And I think sometimes at this level, we see people say it's my district, period. And I just come back to this notion that, one, we are a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. The framers of our constitution could have chosen to have a referendum system on public policy, whether that was at the federal level or when the state constitution was drafted or has been amended multiple times since its inception in the late 19th century. And we don't. It's not purely a show of hands dynamic. And I think what does continue to frustrate me, it frustrated me when I was an advocate, and it does continue to frustrate me today, is that not voting when you do morally know something is right, even if your district doesn't approve of it. And I will say, I think legislators aren't always great at knowing what their district truly wants, right? We have polling that shows a district wants one thing, but because their perspective is based on their own network of people, they presume that their district wants something else. And I think that is oftentimes an easy out. But profiles in courage are never written about people who make a vote based purely on what is popular within their constituency. Profiles in courage are written about people who take the right vote, even when it's hard, even when it puts their political career at risk, which by definition means that they're voting in a way that their voters disagree with. And so I'm very much a believer in the trustee model. I think you have to go issue by issue. There are certain issues where it is basically cut and dry. Is this what my district wants? Yes or no? There are issues where what your district wants and what your district needs and your opinion might actually differ. And then there are issues of fundamental justice and morality where I believe that we have a moral, historic responsibility to vote the way we believe to be right, even if it's unpopular. And those, frankly, the fact that those are the examples that we celebrate in history, I think validates the morality and democratic nature of an elected official voting in a way that might actually end up resulting in them losing an election. So I that's my little tirade on that point, because I do think we see it sometimes.
So you still need in the Senate, you still need 11 votes to pass something, right?
Right.
So
for normal non
right for not 2/3,
yeah.
right? So a not vote really kind of is almost a no vote in a lot of ways, because it can be that not voting that prevents something from passing.
Right. It does default to that no change, right? It's
right.
You know, and whether the bill is pulling something back or the bill is pushing something forward, what you're really voting for is the status quo. And, you know, in some ways it reflects an unwillingness to change. And, you know, to Senator McBride's point, I think we might have had this conversation like the first time we ever met about the trustee and delegate model. So that's how nerdy we are.
Yeah.
But, you know, we agree fundamentally that we have a responsibility to do our due diligence. And I think what that reflects, what that, you know, realistically reflects or in actuality reflects is a lot of studying of bills on our part, and a lot of time to understand what the votes that we are taking mean. And I feel an obligation to do that. And that's the obligation I feel for my district, that they have allowed me this privilege to come and represent them. So I'm going to do the work that the job demands, and take hard votes when I need to.
And sorry, I have one more thought on that, because I just so passionately
have
feelings about this. I also think it fundamentally disrespects our voters to say, I believe that my voters are morally wrong, and I, at the same time, don't think that they're capable of changing. And I think we have a responsibility, and I have seen this time and time again, that I will go into rooms where people disagree with my vote or disagree with my position, and they might come out of it still disagreeing with my position, but they understand why I voted a certain way, or they understand why I believe a certain way. And they're willing to say, I might not agree with you 100% of the time, but I respect where you're coming from. And I think we should show our voters the level of respect to say they are smart enough and thoughtful enough and compassionate enough that if we explain where we're coming from, some of them will actually end up agreeing with us. And many others will say, I respect your thought process and appreciate your thought process. And I think leaders have to lead, and sometimes that means pulling public opinion along with us. And we shouldn't be afraid to exercise that leadership, not just in this building, but when we go back to the community meetings and civic associations and neighborhoods that we represent.
Yeah, I think what Senator McBride is talking about is that giving each other the benefit of the doubt, which I think is probably the kind of lowest level of respect that we can afford each other, and is still sometimes absent in our political conversations. But I think that to your point, Senator, if we are holding ourselves to that standard and we are elevating the conversation around understanding why we are having a disagreement and moving forward in partnership on other issues that we do agree on, you know, I think that we're going to be better off in this hall, and across our nation. We often forget that we all usually vote for the budget, right? So, you know, there are ample opportunities, and we take them here to be bipartisan and work across the aisle. And I think that I think all Delawareans need to see that from us, and we need to talk about that more, that is where we are here, at least in the Senate, and I think in the House too.
Right.
Hi, Terry.
I don't know how I ended up here.
We're happy to see you.
We're glad to see you. I guess that means your session's over?
Yes, it went very well. I'm finding the conversation very interesting. So I'm
Well, the
gonna
good
just,
news is you can go back and watch it.
I
And
know.
this is all going to be available after today.
Stephanie, thanks for your message. It's really appreciate the question.
I'm gonna go off camera and just listen.
Good to see you, Terry.
All right. Well, thank you both. I know you both have session to
You hear
get
the bell
to
ringing?
in about 12 minutes.
Yeah.
Is it ringing?
Yeah.
You got your warning bell. So
Yeah.
I do appreciate you taking time to talk to us on a day that you're in session and things are busy. We certainly look forward to continuing a conversation with both of you in the future.
Oh, it's awesome. Thank you for having us. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Bye.